Hello, my name is James. Welcome to Sleep Stories World. What if I told you that the man who wrote Treasure Island and Jekyll and Hyde found his own greatest adventure not in fiction, but in a real Pacific paradise? That a frail Scottish writer, given up for dead by doctors, sailed halfway around the world and discovered an island that would heal him, a people who would honor him, and a home he would never leave? Tonight, let me take you to Samoa in the 1890s, where Robert Louis Stevenson became Tusitala, the teller of tales, where grateful islanders built him a road of the loving heart, and where he finally found the peace that had eluded him his entire life. This is a true story of transformation, belonging, and the unexpected places we find home. Close your eyes, settle in, and let me carry you to paradise. But first, let's prepare your space for rest. Ensure you're somewhere comfortably cool, dark, and quiet. If you need to adjust anything, your curtains, your temperature, your pillows, please do so now. When you're ready, lie down and let yourself settle into your bed. Feel the weight of your body being supported. You may want to cover yourself with a light blanket as your body relaxes. Now, gently close your eyes. There's nothing you need to see anymore tonight. Your only task now is to be here, allowing yourself to receive the gift of rest. Take a deep breath in through your nose. And exhale slowly through your mouth. Breathe in deeply, feeling your chest expand. Breathe out, feeling your body sink deeper into your bed. In. And out. With each breath, you're signaling to your body that it's safe to rest. Now, imagine being surrounded by a warm, vibrant light. This light is gentle and comforting, carrying with it a deep sense of peace and safety. As you breathe in, let this warm light fill your chest. As you breathe out, imagine it spreading gently through your upper body. Breathe in, and let the light expand through your shoulders, your arms, your back. Breathe out, and feel it filling your stomach, your neck, your head, every space within you glowing softly. If a thought comes by, acknowledge it like watching a leaf float by on a gentle stream, and then let it drift away. There will be time for those thoughts later. Now is for rest. On your next breath in, let the warm light travel downward. Feel it reach your hips, your thighs, your knees. Breathe out and sense it flowing down to your ankles, to your toes. Every part of you now is surrounded by this gentle, warm glow. You are completely enveloped in comfort and peace. Focus on your breath and the warm light surrounding you. If your mind wanders, simply guide it back, gently, to your breath, to the light. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are exactly where you need to be. As we move into tonight's story, allow yourself to let go even more. Let the words wash over you like a gentle tide. You don't need to follow every detail. Simply receive the story as a gift, a soft companion as you journey towards sleep. And now, let us begin. In the autumn of 1889, a frail Scottish writer stepped aboard a trading steamer in Honolulu, seeking something he could barely name. Robert Louis Stevenson was 40 years old, already famous for Treasure Island and the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, yet he carried within him a restlessness that no acclaim could settle. For most of his life, he had been chased by illness. Tuberculosis had shadowed him since childhood, driving him from the damp Edinburgh winters to Switzerland, to the south of France, anywhere the doctors promised cleaner air and kinder climates. But the Pacific had whispered to him differently. During his first voyage through these waters aboard the yacht Coquette in 1888, something fundamental had shifted. The warm trade winds, the endless horizons, the rhythm of island life, all of it seemed to quiet the chronic cough that had plagued him for decades. In these scattered emerald islands, thousands of miles from Victorian England, Stevenson felt his lungs expand with an ease he had almost forgotten was possible. When his ship approached the Samoan Islands in December 1889, Stevenson stood on deck watching the volcanic peaks of Yupo emerge from the morning mist. The island rose from the Pacific like a sculpture of green velvet, its mountains draped in rainforest so dense it seemed to hold secrets in every shadow. This was Samoa, a constellation of islands lying in the heart of Polynesia, roughly halfway between Hawaii and New Zealand, where the international date line bends eastward as if to give these islands one more hour of yesterday's peace. Apia, the small port town on Yupo's north coast, bustled with a peculiar mix of cultures. Samoan families in traditional lava walked past German traders and British missionaries, while American and British warships sat anchored in the harbor, remnants of a recent hurricane that had, just 8 months earlier, destroyed 6 naval vessels and killed over 200 men. The islands, though beautiful, were caught in the crosscurrents of colonial ambition, with Germany, Britain, and the United States all vying for influence over these strategic Pacific jewels. Stevenson had not come seeking politics. He had come seeking life itself, more years, more breath, more mornings. Yet as he walked through Apia's muddy streets that first day, breathing deeply without pain for the first time in memory, he must have sensed that Samoa would offer him something beyond mere survival. The air itself seemed to carry a gentleness, thick with the scent of frangipani and wet earth, warm but not oppressive, moving in breezes that came down from the forested mountains like ancient blessings. Within weeks of arriving, Stevenson learned something extraordinary. In Samoa, there were no seasons as he had known them in Scotland. The temperature remained perpetually between 24 and 30 degrees Celsius year-round. What changed were the rains. The wet season from November to April brought heavy tropical downpours that transformed the landscape into a symphony of waterfalls, while the dry season offered warm, clear days perfect for exploring. This eternal summer held a particular magic for a man who had spent his life fleeing winter. The Scottish writer soon discovered that Samoa comprised 9 islands in total, though only 4 were inhabited, Yupo and Savaii being the largest, with Manono and Vailima much smaller. The islands were volcanic in origin, born millions of years ago from the Pacific's restless tectonic forces, and their youth showed in dramatic landscapes. Black sand beaches, lava fields slowly surrendering to jungle, hot springs that bubbled up from the Earth's memory of fire. Standing on Yupo, Stevenson was walking on an island that had pushed up from the ocean floor less than 5 million years ago, a mere blink in geological time. But it was the Samoan people themselves who truly captivated him. The FAA Samoa, the Samoan way, represented something Stevenson's Victorian world had lost or perhaps never possessed. Here was a culture built on communal harmony rather than individual accumulation, where extended families, or aga, formed the foundation of all social structure, and where chiefs led through consensus and service rather than domination. Stevenson watched Samoan children swimming in the crystal lagoons, their laughter carrying across the water, and saw adults moving through their days with a grace and dignity that seemed to emanate from the land itself. The writer had arrived in paradise, though not the idle, decorative paradise of colonial fantasies. This was a paradise earned through volcanic fire and cooled by patient centuries, a paradise inhabited by a people whose 3,000-year presence in these islands had created something rare, a civilization in profound conversation with the nature that surrounded it. And Stevenson, tired of running, tired of illness, tired perhaps of civilization's discontents, recognized in Samoa not an escape, but a homecoming to a place he had never been. As the Pacific sun set on his first weeks in Samoa, painting the sky in colors that seemed impossible, violet melting into rose, gold bleeding into amber, Robert Louis Stevenson began to understand that these islands would not merely extend his life. They would transform it entirely. 400 feet above the coastal town of Apia, on the slopes of Mount Vaea, Robert Louis Stevenson found a piece of land that spoke to him with uncommon clarity. The property comprised 314 acres of dense tropical rainforest, tangled with vines and giant ferns, alive with the calls of birds he could not yet name. The land had a name already, Vailima, which in the Samoan language meant 5 waters, for the streams that cascaded down through the property from the mountain's misty heights. In January 1890, just weeks after his arrival in Samoa, Stevenson purchased Vailima for $4,000. It was an audacious decision for a man who had spent his life as a wanderer, never truly settling anywhere. But something in this mountainside, with its views across the jungle canopy to the Pacific beyond, convinced him that his traveling days were done. He was home, even if home was a wilderness that would require years to tame. The work of building began almost immediately. Stevenson hired Samoan laborists and threw himself into the project with an energy that surprised even him. Here was a man who had been considered an invalid in Edinburgh, too weak for any physical exertion, now swinging a machete to clear undergrowth, directing the placement of posts, his shirt soaked with honest sweat under the tropical sun. The warm climate that had eased his lungs seemed to invigorate his entire body. His chronic cough, that constant companion of his European years, had grown quiet. The house that slowly rose from the clearing was unlike anything else in Samoa, a 2-story structure that blended Scottish sensibilities with Pacific practicalities. Stevenson designed it with wide verandas to catch the cooling breezes, high ceilings to allow the heat to rise, and large windows that could be opened to the mountain air. The timber was local, cut from trees on the property itself, and the work was done by Samoan craftsmen whose skill with wood had been honed over generations of building fail, the traditional open-sided houses that dotted every village. By October 1890, Stevenson was able to move into Vailima, though the house was far from finished. His wife Fanny joined him, a strong-willed American woman 10 years his senior, who had nursed him through countless bouts of illness and who now threw herself into creating gardens from the jungle. Fanny Vandergriff Stevenson was 50 years old when she arrived at Vailima, a woman who had already lived a remarkable life, married young, widowed, remarried to Stevenson in San Francisco in 1880, and now finding herself mistress of an estate in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They were soon joined by Fanny's daughter from her first marriage, Belle Strong, and Belle's son Austin. Then came Stevenson's mother, Margaret, a widow now in her 60s, who left the grey propriety of Edinburgh to spend her final years in this impossible tropical paradise her son had claimed. The household also included Fanny's son Lloyd Osborne, who served as Stevenson's secretary and collaborator. Together, this unconventional family created what Stevenson called the family estate in Samoa, though in truth it was more like a small village, with up to 20 Samoan staff living on the property. The Samoans who worked at Vailima were not merely servants in the Victorian sense. Stevenson, who had always possessed an instinctive sympathy for those marginalized by empire, treated his staff as members of an extended family. He paid wages that were generous by local standards, $50 per month for skilled workers, and he learned to speak Samoan, albeit imperfectly. The language enchanted him with its musicality, its vocabulary rich in words for subtle distinctions of light on water, for the specific rustle of palm fronds in different winds, for relationships between people that English could not adequately express. In return, the Samoans gave Stevenson a name that revealed how they saw him. They called him Tusitala, the teller of tales. It was a title of respect, for in Samoan culture, stories were not mere entertainment but the living repository of history, wisdom, and identity. Every evening, after the day's work was done, Stevenson would often sit on the veranda with his Samoan workers and tell them stories, sometimes his own published tales, sometimes new ones he invented on the spot. And they would tell him their stories in return, legends of Itu spirits that lived in the forest, of ancient warriors and voyagers, of gods who had walked these islands when the world was young. The building of Vailima continued for years. By 1891, the house had grown to include a grand hall, a library that would eventually hold over 3,000 books shipped from Britain, and guest rooms for the steady stream of visitors who made the pilgrimage to meet the famous author in his jungle retreat. The estate also developed extensive grounds, Fanny-cultivated vegetable gardens and flower beds, while Stevenson oversaw the planting of cacao trees, rubber trees, and copra palms, hoping to make the property at least partially self-sufficient. From his writing room on the second floor, with its view across the forest to the sea, Stevenson could work in a peace he had never known. The temperature at Vailima's elevation remained several degrees cooler than the coast, hovering around 23 degrees even on the warmest days. The trade winds moved through the house like invisible servants, carrying the scent of wild ginger and the distant salt of the ocean. Here, 400 feet above sea level on the slope of an ancient volcano, in a house called Five Waters, a Scottish storyteller had found not just a home, but the possibility of years he had long ceased to expect. At night, when the oil lamps were lit and the forest around Vailima came alive with the sounds of creatures moving through darkness, Stevenson would sit at his desk and write. The words came more easily now, flowing like the streams that gave the property its name, carrying stories from his imagination out into the world, a world that seemed both impossibly far away and somehow less important than this mountainside, this moment, this breath of warm Pacific air that filled his lungs without resistance. The rhythm of life at Vailima followed patterns that would have seemed impossible in Edinburgh or London. Stevenson rose early, often before 6 in the morning, when the air was at its coolest and the forest still held the hush of night. He would take his breakfast on the veranda, tropical fruit that grew wild on the property, papaya and banana and mango, foods that had once seemed exotic luxuries but now were simply part of the daily abundance that surrounded him. By 7 o'clock, while the morning was still fresh, Stevenson would be at his desk in the writing room. This was his sacred time, the hours when his mind was clearest and the words flowed most freely. He worked standing at a specially constructed high desk, pacing as he thought, his pen moving rapidly across the page. In Samoa, Stevenson discovered a productivity that had eluded him during his sickly years in Europe. Between 1890 and 1894, he would complete some of his finest work, the Reka, the beach of Falesa, Catriona, and the ebb tide, all written in this room above the jungle, hundreds of feet above the Pacific. The mornings belonged to fiction, but the afternoons often belonged to Samoa itself. By midday, when the tropical sun made mental work difficult, Stevenson would abandon his desk and turn to physical labor. He supervised the ongoing improvements to Vailima, worked alongside his Samoan staff to clear new trails through the forest, and learned to ride the small, sturdy horses that could navigate the mountain paths. This daily physical exertion, which would have been unthinkable in his European life, seemed to strengthen rather than exhaust him. Meal times at Vailima were formal affairs that preserved a touch of Victorian civilization in the heart of the Pacific. Dinner was served at 7 o'clock sharp, with Stevenson insisting that everyone dress appropriately. He himself often wore a white dinner jacket, and the family gathered in the great hall where a long table could seat a dozen guests. Yet even these civilized dinners had their Samoan character. The food was often local fish and taro, prepared by Samoan cooks who had learned to blend their traditional methods with European tastes, and the conversation flowed in a mixture of English and Samoan. The household staff at Vailima had become like family to Stevenson, and he knew each of them by name and story. There was Sozimo, the cook, whose mastery of both traditional Samoan earth ovens and European-style baking made him invaluable. There was Talolo, the plantation boss, who managed the agricultural work and taught Stevenson the Samoan names for every plant and tree. And there was Lafiel, whom Stevenson called his man Friday, a young Samoan who served as personal attendant and companion, often accompanying the writer on his explorations of the island. Stevenson's relationship with his Samoan household went beyond simple employment. He established a tradition he called family prayers, though it was less about Christian devotion and more about gathering the entire household, Samoan and European alike, in the great hall each evening. Stevenson would read from the Bible, but he would also tell stories, discuss the day's events, and listen to the concerns of his staff. In a colonial world built on hierarchy and racial division, Vailima operated on principles of mutual respect that scandalized some of the European residents of Apia. The writer's day typically ended around 10 o'clock, when the oil lamps were extinguished and the house settled into the sounds of the tropical night. But Stevenson was often a restless sleeper, and he would sometimes rise in the small hours to write letters by lamplight. His correspondence during these Samoan years was voluminous. He maintained contact with friends and publishers across the world, and his letters numbered in the hundreds each year. Through these letters, written in the silence of midnight, Vailima stayed connected to London, New York, and Edinburgh, though those cities seemed to exist in a different universe entirely. Health, which had dominated Stevenson's existence for so long, became something he could almost forget in Samoa. His weight, which had sometimes dropped to as little as 98 pounds during his worst periods of illness in Europe, stabilized and even increased in the tropical climate. The chronic hemorrhages that had terrified his doctors in Scotland simply ceased. He still had occasional bouts of fever. The tropics brought their own ailments, but the fundamental struggle for breath that had defined his life had eased. At Vailima, Stevenson could walk up the mountain trails without stopping to gasp, could work a full day without collapsing, could live without the constant shadow of early death. Yet for all the peace of his daily routine, Stevenson could not ignore what was happening in the wider Samoan world. By 1891, the islands were deep in political turmoil. The competing interests of Germany, Britain, and the United States had created a situation where rival Samoan chiefs were backed by different colonial powers, each vying for control. The traditional system of Samoan governance, complex, nuanced, based on genealogy and consensus, was being torn apart by European interference and the promise of modern weapons to those who would align themselves with foreign powers. Stevenson watched this unfolding crisis with growing concern. He had come to Samoa seeking peace for himself, but he found a people whose peace was being systematically destroyed. The man who had written adventure stories about pirates and treasure islands was about to discover that real adventure, real conflict, and real moral questions existed not in fiction but here, on this island paradise where politics and colonialism were colliding with devastating force. And Stevenson, the storyteller, the invalid writer who had sought only to live a few more years in comfort, would find himself drawn into a struggle that would define the final chapter of his extraordinary life. In the spring of 1891, Stevenson began to understand that neutrality was not an option. The political crisis gripping Samoa was not some distant colonial abstraction. It was happening in the villages he could see from Vailima's veranda, affecting the people who worked beside him each day, threatening to tear apart the culture he had come to deeply respect. Two rival claimants to Samoa's highest title fought for supremacy. Matarafa Iosifo, who had the support of many Samoans and was backed by Germany, and Malaetoa Laupepa, who was supported by Britain and the United States. The conflict was not of Samoan making. For centuries, Samoa had managed its own complex system of governance through the Fa Amati, the system of chiefly titles and family councils that balanced power across the islands. But the Berlin Act of 1889, signed by Germany, Britain, and the United States just months before Stevenson's arrival, had attempted to impose a Western-style kingship on Samoa. The three colonial powers had installed Malaetoa Laupepa as a puppet king while stripping away much of the traditional authority that had kept the island stable for generations. Stevenson began to study Samoan history and politics with the same intensity he brought to his fiction. He interviewed chiefs, attended village councils, and listened to stories of how the islands had been governed before the arrival of Europeans. What he discovered filled him with indignation. The Samoan people, who had developed one of the most sophisticated political systems in the Pacific over 3,000 years of continuous habitation, were being treated by the colonial powers as children incapable of self-governance. By July 1892, the simmering tensions erupted into open warfare. Matarafa's forces, armed with modern rifles supplied by German traders, clashed with supporters of Malaetoa. The fighting was brief but brutal, and it brought the violence uncomfortably close to Vailima. Stevenson could hear gunfire echoing through the valleys, and wounded men from both sides began appearing at his door, knowing that Tusitala would turn no one away. Stevenson transformed part of Vailima into a makeshift hospital. Fanny and Belle tended to the wounded, binding wounds and offering what medical care they could. Stevenson himself moved among the injured men, Samoan warriors who just days before had been trying to kill each other, now lying side by side under his roof. He was appalled by what he saw, not the wounds themselves, but the waste of it all, the knowledge that these men were dying in a conflict manufactured by foreign powers who cared nothing for Samoan welfare. The war ended in a matter of weeks with Matarafa's defeat. The colonial powers declared Malaetoa the victor, though everyone knew the German warships in the harbor had decided the outcome more than any Samoan battle. Matarafa was captured and, in September 1893, he and several of his chiefs were exiled to the distant island of Jaluit in the Marshall Islands, over 2,000 miles away, a punishment that seemed designed to break the spirit of resistance. This exile outraged Stevenson. Matarafa, whatever his political choices, was a Samoan high chief, a man of dignity and traditional authority, now imprisoned on a remote atoll far from his homeland. Stevenson began a letter-writing campaign that would make him famous, or infamous, among the colonial administrators. He wrote to the Times of London, penning a series of letters that laid bare the injustices being perpetrated in Samoa. His prose, usually reserved for fiction, now burned with righteous anger as he described how three great powers were cynically manipulating Samoan politics for commercial advantage. These letters, published throughout 1892 and 1893, brought Stevenson both praise and condemnation. Many in Britain saw him as a troublemaker, a romantic writer who didn't understand the necessities of colonial governance. The British consul in Apia, a man named Thomas Cusick Smith, came to view Stevenson as a dangerous agitator and tried to have his movements restricted. German authorities considered him a British agent stirring up unrest. Only the American consul seemed sympathetic, though even he counseled Stevenson to be more cautious. But Stevenson refused to be silenced. In 1892, he began working on a book that would tell the full story of what was happening in Samoa. He called it a footnote to history, 8 Years of Trouble in Samoa. The book was extraordinary, part history, part journalism, part passionate advocacy. Stevenson detailed the complex web of Samoan politics, explained the traditional system that the colonial powers were destroying, and documented specific incidents of European manipulation and betrayal. He wrote with clarity and controlled fury, making the case that the Samoan people deserved to govern themselves according to their own ancient traditions. A footnote to history was published in 1892, initially serialized in newspapers before appearing as a book. The colonial administrators in Samoa were appalled. Here was one of the most famous writers in the English-speaking world using his literary reputation to expose their actions to international scrutiny. The book sold well in Britain and America, and while it did not immediately change policy, it planted seeds of doubt about the colonial enterprise in the minds of thousands of readers. Through all this political activity, Stevenson never forgot that he was first and foremost a guest in Samoa. He was careful to frame his advocacy not as a European telling Samoans what to do, but as someone trying to amplify Samoan voices that were being deliberately ignored. He used his platform not to impose his own vision, but to argue that Samoans should be allowed to shape their own destiny. In an age of unquestioning imperial confidence, this was a radical position. The Samoan people noticed. Word spread across the islands that Tusitala had spoken for them, that the famous writer at Vailima was using his words as weapons against those who would dominate them. Chiefs who had never met Stevenson began to regard him as an ally. Young Samoans who worked at Vailima carried home stories of a European who treated them as equals, who learned their language, who was not afraid to stand against his own people when they acted unjustly. In his study at Vailima, surrounded by books shipped from London and cooled by breezes that carried the scent of the Pacific, Robert Louis Stevenson had discovered something unexpected. He had come to Samoa to save his own life, but in the process, he had found a cause worth living for. The storyteller had become an advocate, the invalid had become a voice for the voiceless, and the man who had written tales of adventure had stumbled into the greatest adventure of all, the struggle for justice in an imperfect world. In late 1893, an unexpected gift arrived at Vailima that would touch Stevenson more deeply than any literary prize or public acclaim. Word came from the distant Marshall Islands that Mataafa and his fellow exiled chiefs were being allowed to return to Samoa. The colonial powers, embarrassed by international criticism and worn down by Stevenson's relentless advocacy, had relented. Mataafa would not be restored to power, but at least he could come home. When Matarafa's ship arrived in Apia harbor in November 1893, one of his first acts was to visit Vailima. The exiled chief, still a figure of immense dignity despite his imprisonment, came to thank the Scottish writer who had championed his cause. The meeting between these two men, one a Samoan high chief steeped in ancient tradition, the other a frail European storyteller, was brief but profound. They spoke through interpreters, yet something passed between them that needed no translation. Matarafa had not forgotten who had spoken for him when he had no voice. In the weeks that followed, a remarkable plan took shape. Matarafa's chiefs, after consulting among themselves, decided they wanted to give Stevenson a gift that would honor him in the Samoan way. They would build him a road. Not a simple path, but a proper road that would connect Vailima to the main track leading down to Apia, making the journey to and from the estate far easier than the difficult trail that currently served. The proposal astonished Stevenson. In Samoan culture, the building of roads was traditionally the responsibility of chiefs and their people working together in communal labor called malaga. For Matarafa's supporters to offer this work to a European was unprecedented. It was a gesture that spoke of genuine gratitude and respect. Stevenson tried to decline, embarrassed by the magnitude of the offer, but the chiefs would not be dissuaded. They would build the road, and they would accept no payment for it. Work began in early 1894. Hundreds of Samoans, men and women both, came to Vailima bearing tools, axes, machetes, digging sticks, and baskets for carrying earth and stone. They came from villages across Yupo, some walking for hours to participate. Many of these workers had supported Matarafa in the recent conflict. Some had fought in the battles, others had simply shared the chief's vision of Samoan self-determination. Now they would honor the man who had fought for them with words rather than weapons. The construction took several months. The Samoans worked in the traditional way, clearing forest, cutting through hillsides, building up low spots with countless loads of earth and volcanic rock. They sang as they worked, traditional songs that had accompanied communal labor for centuries, the rhythm of the chants matching the swing of tools and the movement of bodies. Stevenson would come down from the house to watch, marveling at the coordination, the efficiency, the sense of shared purpose that animated the workers. The road, when finished, stretched for more than a mile, a smooth, wide path that curved gracefully down the mountainside, engineered with a skill that would have impressed European road builders. It was roughly 12 feet wide, carefully graded to handle the tropical rains that could turn any trail into a mudslide. In some places, the workers had cut steps into the hillside. In others, they had built up substantial embankments. The entire project represented thousands of hours of labor, all given freely. The Samoans named it the Ala Loto Alofa, the Road of the Loving Heart. The name was chosen deliberately, and it carried layers of meaning. Alofa in Samoan meant love, but a love deeper than mere affection. It encompassed compassion, generosity, and the bonds of mutual obligation that held communities together. This road was built from Alofa, both as an expression of love for Stevenson and as a recognition of the love he had shown for the Samoan people. On the day the road was officially completed, a great celebration was held at Vailima. Chiefs and workers gathered in the clearing before the house, and a formal ceremony took place according to Samoan custom. Speeches were made, gifts were exchanged, and food was shared from traditional earth ovens. Stevenson, dressed in a white suit, his face tanned by the tropical sun, stood before the assembled crowd and tried to express his gratitude. His Samoan was still imperfect, and he stumbled over words, but no one cared. They understood what he was trying to say. In his response, Stevenson made a promise. He told the gathered Samoans that the road they had built would always remain open to them, that they would always be welcome at Vailima, that his house was their house. And then, in a gesture that surprised even his own family, he announced that when he died, whenever that might be, he wished to be buried at the summit of Mount Vaea, the mountain that rose above Vailima. He wanted to remain in Samoa forever, to rest in this land that had given him more years of life and more happiness than he had ever dared to hope for. The declaration moved many in the crowd to tears. For a European to choose burial in Samoa, rather than requesting his body be returned to his homeland, was extraordinary. It was a statement of belonging that transcended race and culture. Stevenson was saying, in the clearest possible terms, that he had become part of Samoa, that this was not merely a temporary refuge but his true home. The Road of the Loving Heart became one of Stevenson's greatest sources of pride. He would write to friends in Europe about it, describing it with more enthusiasm than he showed for many of his published works. The road was proof, he said, that different peoples could understand each other, could respect each other, could work together in mutual affection despite all the barriers that empires and prejudices tried to erect. In a world increasingly divided by colonial racism, the Road of the Loving Heart stood as a monument to what was possible when human beings met each other with open hearts. Stevenson walked that road almost every day for the rest of his life. Sometimes he would go down to Apia on business. Other times he would simply stroll partway down and back as exercise. Each time he set foot on those smooth stones and packed earth, he was reminded that he was walking on love made tangible, on gratitude transformed into something solid and enduring. The road carried him physically down the mountain, but it also carried a deeper meaning. It was a connection between worlds, built by hands that had once held weapons in futile war, now offering a path toward something better. The year 1894 began with a sense of contentment at Vailima that Stevenson had rarely known in his life. The house was complete, the gardens were flourishing, the Road of the Loving Heart wound down the mountainside like a ribbon of goodwill, and his health remained remarkably stable. At 43 years old, Stevenson had outlived the expectations of every doctor who had examined him in his youth. The man who had been given up for dead a dozen times was thriving in paradise. His writing continued with undiminished energy. Stevenson was working on 2 novels simultaneously that autumn, Weir of Hermiston, which he believed might be his masterpiece, and St. Ives, a lighter adventure tale. He wrote in the mornings as always, his pen moving rapidly across the pages, creating worlds far removed from the tropical reality outside his windows. Weir of Hermiston was set in Scotland, drawing on memories of the Edinburgh of his youth, the grey stone streets and bitter winds that seemed impossibly distant from the warmth of Samoa. The household routine at Vailima had settled into comfortable patterns. Fanny managed the estate with fierce efficiency, supervising the gardens and the kitchen, ordering supplies from Sydney and San Francisco. Belle helped her stepfather with correspondence, typing his manuscripts on a battered typewriter that clicked away for hours each day. Lloyd Osborne worked on his own writing projects while serving as Stevenson's secretary. And Margaret Stevenson, now 65 years old, presided over the household with gentle dignity. A Scottish grandmother transplanted to the Pacific, somehow entirely at home in both worlds. The Samoan staff had become true members of the family. So Zimo's cooking had evolved into a unique fusion. Traditional Samoan dishes prepared with European techniques, European meals enriched with tropical ingredients. On special occasions, Entire pigs would be roasted in earth ovens called umu, wrapped in banana leaves and cooked over hot stones for hours until the meat fell from the bone. These feasts brought together everyone at Vailima, European and Samoan alike, sharing food and stories late into the tropical night. Stevenson's connection to the Samoan people had deepened over the years. He was now consulted by chiefs on matters of policy, asked for advice on how to navigate the treacherous waters of colonial politics. His command of the Samoan language had improved considerably. He could conduct basic conversations, understand the elaborate formal speeches given at ceremonies, and even make simple jokes that earned appreciative laughter. The honorary title Tusitala had become more than just a name. It reflected a genuine role he played in the community. On December 3, 1894, Stevenson woke early as usual and worked through the morning on Weir of Hermiston. The writing was going exceptionally well. He had just completed a chapter that he felt captured something essential about human nature, about fathers and sons, about justice and mercy. At lunch, he was animated, discussing the book with Fanny and reading sections aloud, his voice full of enthusiasm. The afternoon stretched before him, warm and peaceful, just another day in paradise. Around 2 o'clock, Stevenson decided to help Fanny prepare mayonnaise for dinner, a small domestic task he enjoyed. He was talking and laughing in the kitchen when suddenly he stopped mid-sentence. His hand went to his head, and he said something about a sharp pain. Fanny looked up in alarm as Stevenson's face went pale. He tried to take a step, but his legs wouldn't support him. He collapsed, and Fanny barely managed to catch him as he fell. They carried him to the great hall and laid him on the floor. A message was sent urgently down the new road to Apia, calling for doctors. Stevenson was unconscious, breathing but unresponsive. Fanny knelt beside him, holding his hand, while Bell and Lloyd hovered nearby in shock. The Samoan staff gathered silently, watching with stricken faces as the man who had become the heart of Vailima lay motionless on the wooden floor. 2 doctors arrived from Apia as quickly as they could, making the journey up the road of the loving heart in record time. But there was nothing they could do. Stevenson had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, a blood vessel had burst in his brain, and the damage was catastrophic. He never regained consciousness. At 10 minutes past 8 that evening, December 3, 1894, Robert Louis Stevenson died, surrounded by his family in the house he had built on the island that had become his home. The news spread through Samoa with stunning speed. By dawn the next morning, Samoans were arriving at Vailima from all over Yupo, coming to pay their respects to Tusitala. They came in traditional mourning dress, many weeping openly for the man who had been their friend and advocate. Chiefs arrived with their retinues, and soon the lawn before the great house was filled with hundreds of Samoans sitting in quiet grief. Stevenson had asked to be buried on Mount Vaea, and the Samoans were determined to honor that wish. But the summit was more than 1,000 feet above Vailima, accessible only by steep, densely forested slopes with no trail. It would be an enormous undertaking to carry a coffin to the top. Yet when the family mentioned the difficulty, Samoan chiefs immediately volunteered their people for the task. They would cut a path and carry Tusitala to his final resting place. On the morning of December 4th, work parties of Samoan men attacked the mountainside with machetes and axes. They cut a path straight up through the jungle, hacking through vines and undergrowth, clearing away ferns and saplings. It was back-breaking labor in brutal heat, cutting a trail up a 60-degree slope in places, but the work never slowed. By afternoon, A path had been carved from Vailima to the summit of Mount Vaea, over a mile of new trail cut in a single day. That afternoon, 60 Samoan chiefs and warriors took turns carrying Stevenson's coffin up the mountain. They climbed in relays, switching bearers every few hundred feet as the slope grew steeper. The coffin was made of polished native wood, and it was heavy, but the Samoans carried it with extraordinary care, ensuring it never tilted or jolted. Behind them came the family. Fanny, supported by friends, her face a mask of grief, Lloyd and Belle, Margaret Stevenson, climbing the steep trail despite her age, and hundreds of mourners, both European and Samoan. At the summit, a grave had been cut into the volcanic rock. The view from this spot was everything Stevenson could have dreamed. The forest-covered slopes of Yupo rolling away in all directions, the Pacific Ocean stretching to the horizon, the reef-enclosed lagoon shimmering turquoise in the afternoon sun. This was the view he had looked at for 5 years from Vailima's veranda, and now it would be his view for eternity. The funeral service was simple. Prayers were read in English and Samoan, and hymns were sung in both languages, the voices of mourners rising into the tropical air. Then the coffin was lowered into the grave, and Samoans and Europeans alike took turns placing tropical flowers on top, brilliant red hibiscus, fragrant frangipani, and garlands of leaves woven in traditional patterns. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in the impossible colors Stevenson had loved, the grave was sealed with a concrete tomb. On the tomb, they inscribed the epitaph Stevenson himself had written years earlier, a poem that now seemed heartbreakingly prophetic. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill. Robert Louis Stevenson had come to Samoa seeking a few more years of life. He had found those years, and in finding them, he had discovered something far more precious, a home, a purpose, and a people who loved him not for his fame but for his character. The invalid storyteller from Scotland had become a voice for justice, a friend to a nation, and finally, a permanent part of the island paradise he had claimed as his own. At the summit of Mount Vaea, above the house called Five Waters, beneath the wide Pacific sky, Tusitala rests still, the storyteller who became part of the greatest story of all, the story of Samoa itself. In the days following Stevenson's death, Samoa mourned as it had rarely mourned before. The colonial administrators in Apia were astonished by the outpouring of grief from the Samoan people. High chiefs declared periods of traditional mourning, and entire villages observed customs usually reserved for the death of their own paramount leaders. For weeks, Samoans would make the pilgrimage up Mount Vaea to visit the grave, leaving offerings of flowers and woven mats, sitting in silence beneath the spreading trees that shaded the tomb. The family faced an uncertain future. Fanny was 54 years old, widowed for the second time, and the prospect of remaining at Vailima without Robert seemed unbearable. Yet she stayed for several months, unable to immediately leave the place that had been so central to their lives. Margaret Stevenson, grieving the loss of her only son, made the difficult decision to return to Scotland. At 65, she would spend her remaining years back in Edinburgh, though she carried Samoa in her heart until her death in 1897, just 3 years after Robert's passing. Vailima itself continued for a time under Fanny's uncertain management. The Samoan staff remained loyal, tending the gardens and maintaining the house as if Stevenson might walk through the door at any moment. But the soul had gone out of the place. The great hall where stories had been told and laughter had echoed now felt hollow. The writing room where Tusitala had created his final work stood empty, his desk gathering dust, his pens lying silent. By 1897, Fanny could bear it no longer. She sold Vailima to a German trading company for a fraction of what it had cost to build. The sale broke her heart, but remaining was impossible. Everywhere she looked, she saw Robert's presence, felt his absence. She returned to California, taking with her only personal possessions and memories. The library of 3,000 books was dispersed, the furniture sold or given away, the physical remnants of their Pacific paradise scattered to the winds. Yet even as Vailima passed into other hands, Stevenson's legacy in Samoa remained vibrant and alive. The Road of the Loving Heart was maintained by Samoans who continued to see it as sacred ground, a monument to the friendship between Tusitala and their people. For decades afterward, elderly Samoans would tell their grandchildren about the Scottish writer who had spoken for them, who had treated them as equals, who had chosen to remain with them forever on the mountain. In the wider world, Stevenson's death at 44 was seen as a tragedy, a brilliant literary career cut short just as it was reaching new heights. Weir of Hermiston, left unfinished on his desk that December day, was published posthumously in 1896 and was immediately recognized as potentially his greatest work. Literary critics mourned what might have been, the book Stevenson would never write, the stories that died with him on that December evening. But perhaps the truest measure of Stevenson's legacy was not in the books he left unfinished, but in the impact he had on the place he called home. In 1920, 26 years after his death, New Zealand took over administration of Samoa from Germany, which had lost its Pacific colonies after World War I. The new administrators, reviewing the history of the islands, were struck by Stevenson's writings about Samoan self-determination. His arguments, made decades earlier, had planted seeds that would eventually grow into the movement for Samoan independence. The tomb on Mount Vaea became a pilgrimage site not just for Samoans but for visitors from around the world. Readers of Treasure Island and Kidnapped, of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and A Child's Garden of Verses, would make their way to Samoa to pay respects to the author whose words had enchanted them. They would climb the trail to the summit, eventually made into proper steps, and stand at the gravesite, reading the epitaph carved in stone, looking out over the same view Stevenson had loved. During World War II, American forces stationed in Samoa maintained the tomb and the trail, recognizing the site's cultural significance. Sailors and soldiers who had grown up reading Stevenson's adventure tales found themselves in the place where he had spent his final years, and many made the climb to Mount Vaea, leaving behind flowers and small tokens of respect. The grave survived the war unscathed, protected by both Samoans and the foreign troops who occupied the islands. When Western Samoa finally achieved independence in 1962, the first Pacific island nation to regain sovereignty in the 20th century, the new government specifically honored Stevenson's memory. Leaders spoke of Tusitala as a friend to Samoan self-determination, a voice that had spoken for them when few others would. The Road of the Loving Heart was formally recognized as a historic site, and the government committed to maintaining both the road and the tomb as national treasures. Vailima itself underwent a remarkable transformation. After serving various purposes under German, New Zealand, and then Samoan administration, at times a government residence, at times offices, the house was eventually restored and opened as a museum in 1994, exactly 100 years after Stevenson's death. Today, visitors can walk through the rooms where Tusitala lived and worked, see reproductions of his furniture and possessions, and stand on the veranda where he watched the sun set over the Pacific. The museum tells the story not just of a writer, but of a friendship between a Scottish storyteller and a Pacific Island people. Exhibits detail the political struggles Stevenson documented, the road of the loving heart built in his honor, and the ways his advocacy influenced later movements toward independence. For modern Samoans, Stevenson is remembered not primarily as a literary figure, but as a man who saw them as they truly were, a sophisticated people with their own wisdom, deserving of respect and self-determination. On the centennial of his death in 1994, Samoa held elaborate commemorations. Chiefs performed traditional ceremonies at the tomb. Speeches were given in both English and Samoan, and the Prime Minister of independent Samoa spoke of the enduring bond between Tusitala and the Samoan people. The Road of the Loving Heart was rededicated, and new markers were placed along its length, telling the story of why it was built and what it represented. Today, more than 130 years after Stevenson first arrived in Samoa, his presence remains woven into the fabric of the islands. School children learn about Tusitala in their history classes, reading his descriptions of Samoan culture alongside traditional legends. The tomb on Mount Vaea is visited by thousands each year, tourists and Samoans alike, and it remains one of the most recognizable landmarks in the country. The view from that summit, unchanged by time, still shows the forest rolling down to the sea, the lagoon glittering in the sun, the Pacific stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Robert Louis Stevenson came to Samoa seeking only to live a few years longer, to breathe more easily, to escape the cold that was killing him. What he found was so much more, a home that embraced him, a people who honored him, a purpose that gave meaning to his final years. He had been a successful writer in London and Edinburgh, but in Samoa he became something greater, a bridge between worlds, a voice for justice, a friend to a nation. The man who wrote tales of adventure for boys discovered real adventure in unlikely places, not in treasure islands or battles with pirates, but in standing with the powerless against the powerful, in learning to see the world through different eyes, in choosing love over indifference. And in the end, he found the greatest treasure of all, a place to call home, not as a visitor or colonizer, but as someone who belonged, who was claimed by the land and the people as surely as he claimed them. At the summit of Mount Vaea, the storyteller rests beneath the stars he wrote about, surrounded by the island he loved, watched over by the people who built him a road from their loving hearts. The trade winds still blow through the forest as they did when Stevenson walked these slopes. The Pacific still stretches to the horizon, endless and blue. And the stories endure, both the ones he wrote and the one he lived. The story of a man who came to paradise and stayed forever. The story of Samoa and Tusitala, bound together across time by roads of stone and paths of affection that will never fade. Paradise found him. Paradise kept him. And paradise remembers him still. And as we rest now, more than a century after Tusitala closed his eyes for the last time, we can imagine that December evening in 1894, the tropical darkness settling over Vailima, the sound of Samoan voices singing softly in mourning, the stars appearing one by one over Mount Vaea. A man who had spent his life running from death had finally found peace, not in escape, but in belonging. He had sailed halfway around the world seeking a few more years, and he found a home that would hold him forever. Rest now, as Stevenson rested on that mountainside, surrounded by the island he loved. Let the trade winds that cooled Vailima's verandas carry you gently into sleep. Let the sound of waves breaking on distant reefs become the rhythm of your breathing, slow and steady and calm. The journey is complete, the stories are told, and all that remains is the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a home well found, a love well given. Close your eyes and imagine the view from Mount Vaea, the forest rolling down to the sea, the lagoon shimmering in starlight, the Pacific stretching endlessly toward tomorrow. Imagine the road of the loving heart winding down through the darkness, built from gratitude and affection, a path that connected worlds and hearts. Imagine a Scottish storyteller finding paradise not in escape from the world, but in embracing it fully, in seeing beauty where others saw only distance, in finding family where others saw only strangers. Let these images carry you now into your own peaceful rest. Let the warmth of the tropics ease any tension from your shoulders. Let the gentleness of Samoan voices singing in the darkness soothe any worried thoughts. You are safe, you are home, you are exactly where you need to be. Like Stevenson, you have traveled through your day, and now it is time to rest. The stars that watched over Vailima still shine over Samoa tonight. The mountain still stands. The ocean still whispers against the shore. And somewhere in the eternal now, a storyteller rests beneath those stars, home at last, the hunter home from the hill, the sailor home from the sea. Sleep well, traveler. Let Samoa's peace become your peace. Let the loving heart that built a road become the loving kindness that carries you through the night. Dream of tropical gardens and mountain streams, of stories told by lamplight and friendships that transcend all boundaries. Dream of finding your own paradise, your own home, your own place of perfect belonging. Rest now, beneath the wide and starry sky, gladly, peacefully, completely. Sleep well.